Good afternoon and welcome everybody on this Thursday, July 9th, on this hopefully where you are, a warm summer day. Thank you for taking the time for joining us today for our third series of our Paradigm Shift webinar series on making the transition to a circular economy. Today's webinar is focusing on the future of recycling in the United States. Just a little bit of context, Paradigm Shift Solutions Driving the Circular Transformation features today two speakers, two authors, from our publication. We have John Hocevar here today and Keefe Harrison. I encourage you to take a second and take some time to read the publications at its full length, because there's some really good tidbits of information of how we can make the transition to a circular economy. On that note, listen, normally when we do webinars, it's this really formal approach, and I'm going to make it formally informal. Today, I have two friends joining us today. First of all, we have Keefe Harrison. She's the founder and the CEO of the Recycling Partnerships, nonprofit advancing the circular economy in the United States. I know she's no stranger to many of you here today on the call. What's great about the Recycling Partnership is it has partnered with over 1,700 community organizations and 50 plus corporate funders, really dedicating itself to putting an end to waste as we know it. And also, we're really lucky to have John Hocevar, a marine biologist at heart. John is the Ocean Campaigns Director for Greenpeace, and he is a really big voice in the ocean plastic space as well as having really good insight into the state of recycling. So thank you, Keefe and John, for joining us. We're really happy to have you here today. On that note, I'd like to transition a little bit to Pyxera Global. So first of all, my name is John Holm. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at Pyxera Global, and also I lead all of our circular economy strategy and initiatives here with our team, trying to make it transition us to an inclusive circular economy. On that note, I just kicked out, technical glitch. On that note, some of the partners that we have in the space include the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, Closed Loop Partners, Greenbiz, the Recycling Partnership here, Thread First Mile, Council of the Great Lakes Region, Arizona State. But I think one thing that's really important about our role in this space is really building an inclusive circular economy where, all members of society participate in it, not just the ones at the top of the pyramid who are able to have the extra income to buy essentially upcycled products. On that note, I'd like to transition a little bit to the agenda before handing it over to Keefe. What we have here today, having a little bit of, here, 1 second. Really get into the agenda. What we're going to talk about today is the future state of recycling in the U.S. Keefe is going to kick us off talking a little bit about what the Recycling Partnership is doing in the space and what their role is, especially in a COVID-19 environment that we live in, and then transition to John for some context of what his thoughts are on the future state of recycling in the U.S. Then we're going to move into a discussion on the challenges and solutions. So we're really going to have an open Q&A a little bit, discussing what we see as our future in the space. Then we're going to open it up to you folks. And when we open it up to you, we encourage you to write your questions in the chat. We will be sure to get to those questions and then bring them up as we move forward. We have an audience member who are taking the questions and we'll be feeding them through. So please, any time of the presentation, write your question in the chat and we'll be sure to try to answer it. And then we're going to wrap up with some final thoughts. So on that note, I would like to hand over now to Keefe. So Keefe Harrison, if you can take the lead here and guide us through a little bit about what your vision is for the role of recycling in North America.
Sounds good. I'd be happy to. And I'm seeing the future state of recycling. There you are. Great. Yes. Thank you. So hey everyone, it's good to be here today in July. Hope everyone's having a good summer, staying healthy. I was excited to be part of this conversation because I felt today was a chance for us to think about not how do we solve for a package or a material or a product, but how do we pause and really reimagine a better system. And that's what we're working towards every day at the partnership, and working with important partners like those who are on this call to make sure that we're not just chipping away at solutions, but we're driving something different. So next, John, if we look at what the partnership is up to, John mentioned we have about it's now more than 1,700 community partners, but we've placed more than 700,000 community or new recycling carts on the ground, which is an example of how we're trying to make sure that the access to a healthier, more sustainable life is available for everyone. And today, during our discussion, we do want to talk about environmental justice and social justice and what it means to brown and black families, specifically as we address overcoming environmental hazards. So I think it's important to talk about the metrics that we use to measure our success, because we really are working on understanding the different levers that must be pulled. And if you go to the next one, I wanted to say that we also try to work with everyone in the supply chain. And I think that this is something that's critical to this work, that it's very easy to point fingers at who has a responsibility to solve problems when it comes to recycling and the circular economy. We believe firmly that everyone who is involved with making a material and putting it out into the world is responsible for getting it back. And so the work that we do is almost primarily corporate funded, and to date, we've had more than $120 million pledged that we turn right around and put into work in form of grants and resources for those local governments to lift up and build a better system. And I just wanted to open with this because I think that this is a challenging topic. And it's pretty easy for people to understand why they might want corporate influence out of elections, but does that hold true for things like trying to solve recycling? We think that we want our corporate and partners at the table with driving solutions. And at the partnership, when we see a sustainability goal around recycling, we know it's our job to insist and assist them in reaching those goals. So let's talk about those goals. John, on the next slide, we released a report last year that had 3 key findings, and I wanted to make sure that we shared these with you today, of what would it take to not just repair the US recycling system, but really to pivot to an advanced approach, one that ensures that when products are designed, their end of life is at mind. And finding number 1 is that the speed of packaging is far outpaced the capabilities of our infrastructure. And if we're going to what that really gets to is recycling is a reaction, right? When there's a big enough pile of stuff that some entrepreneur can figure out how to turn it into something new, recycling happens, and with it, the environmental benefits. But if you just wait for that entrepreneurial spirit to create a solution, you're living in reactive land. What we need to focus on is proactive land, where design for circularity, material selection, and careful choices around what goes into the process of delivering goods to Americans are considered. And so we think about a system approach to overcoming finding number 1. Finding number 2 goes on to say that the current U.S. form is not going to be able to deliver the amount of material that's demanded. As we see companies making pledges through their Ellen MacArthur Foundation pledges and others, we look to the system and do we see enough supply? We see the potential for enough supply, but we see that a lot of material is still locked in the household, and that more work needs to be done on the infrastructure to be able to extract not just commonly recyclable stuff like boxes, but also the future of recyclables like tubes. Just yesterday, we launched the Polypropylene Recycling Coalition, which will inject capital right into the system to get more polypropylene recycling. So we see a huge opportunity, and internally, we're targeting more than $250 million worth of work over the next 5 years that we intend to solve for some of these supply chain gaps. If there's any silver lining in coronavirus, and they are minor, but I think one of them is that people understand that recycling is a supply chain, right? Toilet paper boxes that are delivering stuff to us, those come out of a MRF. The material for that is often a recycled content. And that's the world that we're working towards, is really making sure that recycled can compete with virgin on quality, quantity, and availability. And that's this idea of a supply chain. How do we make sure that we're sourcing a more reliable environmental supply chain is super important. The third finding that the report brought forward is that this gets to the system thing, that unless we have some organized approach to ensuring that all the pieces from design, end market, community engagement are engaged at once, that we're not going to be able to see the change that many of us are pledging for. And we think that policy is a key missing space, or key missing tool in the US landscape. There is no policy playbook, right? There's no one example that works so perfectly in one country that it can be uniquely or immediately applied to another. So we are working on a very uniquely American approach to policy, one that engages producers, communities, and federal government in engaging in a better system. And I think that when we stop thinking about how do we solve for just a product or a material, and instead we think about a system, then we're headed in the right direction. And we'd be remiss to not talk about the fact that that the work that we must do in this space must work to roll back some of the environmental racism that's been facing brown and black families. So the image that's on the screen is part of a program that we've been working on with CocaCola that is under embargo right now. It's not on social media out of protest. But I think that what gives me hope is since day one, we've worked to make sure that there's this environmental social justice component to our grants. As we're pouring dollars into local governments, we are working hard to make sure that they're not just targeting certain populations, but reaching all of them. And some work that we've been doing with the city of Atlanta on really understanding behaviors and what makes people engaged have some really fascinating details that help to erode some of the myths around recycling, that recycling is only important to certain demographics or certain economic standards, and we can't wait to produce some of the information from here. So from today, I just wanted to lay out a couple things around what system means to us, why we believe that companies must be part of the solution, and we must insist and assist them in delivering something meaningful, and that the overall goal for work must be to serve all people and having access to a healthier, more sustainable life. I look forward to questions and conversations. That makes webinars way more interesting. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, John H., so we can get to the other John H. Got a two John H. Thank you.
Thank you, Keefe. No, I really appreciate it, and thanks for all your comments, especially your point on the actions you're looking to take with environmental racism. And on that note, John, I want to, John Hocevar, so another John H., hand it over to you for a sec. Before diving in a little bit to your overall thoughts on the state of recycling in the United States, what actions are you looking at with Greenpeace and yourself involved in around environmental racism specifically, and some of the actions that you and your team are taking around this issue?
It's a pretty big focus for us. We put out several statements in solidarity for the movement with the movement for Black Lives. I'd say that dismantling institutional racism is essential to meeting any of our goals as an environmental group. So we work pretty closely in partnership with a pretty broad range of organizations. And I'd say that, it probably was never possible to be effective if you were just an environmental organization and just thinking about environmental issues in a silo. It's certainly not now. These issues are so interconnected that, again, for us to be effective in meeting any environmental goals that are big enough to be worth fighting for, we have to be dealing with racism. And it's so pervasive in this country that there's just no way around that.
No, thank you for that. I think, one thing that we look at, with our approach to the circular economy you mentioned earlier is being inclusive and really looking at it where if you're working, for example, in the city of Chicago, you're focusing on the Black community in the South and West Side to be participatory in it, not to be excluded. And the engagement of the circular economy and the environment, it's crucial to not just talk to those organizations, but talk with them, talk with people to lift it up. So thank you for both of your voices in this space. I want to move it now, John. I want to talk a little bit about Greenpeace's role and what you're doing in the recycling space. Now, you recently published a report on the state of MRFs in the United States. Can you just give a little context or a high-level overview of that report and some of the findings that you found?
Sure, yeah, I definitely will dig into that. I'm joining you from Chocowinity, North Carolina today, where I'm visiting my folks. And recycling is on the front page of the local paper because Beaufort County just announced they will no longer be accepting household recycling. And like most Americans, my mom feels really strongly about the importance of recycling. She's new to sort her recycling into separate bins for paper and containers decades after we switched to single stream. Old habits die hard. So it's going to be a long time before any of us get used to the idea of throwing cans and bottles into the trash. But hopefully we can fix things long before that happens. I'm going to talk a little bit about plastic in general and then dig into the report.
Great.
We've made it a priority at Greenpeace to end single-use plastic. Plastic production has been increasing nearly 4% a year, even as many of the corporations producing and selling the trillions of throwaway plastic items each year work to convince us that they want to end plastic pollution. Plastic pollution is not a problem we can recycle our way out of. We need to focus on turning off the tap, phasing out single-use plastics as quickly as possible. And this is necessary not just to protect our oceans and to prevent sea turtles and whales from choking on plastic bags. We have put so much plastic into our world that it's now in our food, our water, and even the air we breathe. The other day, scientists reported finding millions of bits of plastic inside apples, pears, carrots, and broccoli. For a second, it may not be possible anymore to eat a piece of fruit without eating enormous numbers of plastic particles. It may well be a long time before we truly understand the full range of implications of that for human health. But in the meantime, we know enough to be pretty concerned. Chemicals commonly used in plastic packaging, commonly used in plastic packaging can cause cancer and reproductive health impacts. Some have been linked to diabetes and to degraded immune system function. My father has a bunch of serious health issues, including diabetes and cancer, and he's not the kind of person to much. But this week, being home, we've been talking about what he thinks will ultimately kill him, like fare for a vacation. But he's a big reader, and he'd already heard about the study about plastic in fruits and vegetables. From his perspective, as someone with multiple diseases that are often fatal, he wasn't sure how worried we should be about microplastics. But at the end of the day, he said, if plastic makes our bodies less able to fight off diseases, that should be enough to make anyone think twice right now. Plastic is made from fossil fuels and is helping drive new oil and gas extraction that we can no longer afford. The production and refinement of plastic is poisoning low-income communities in its wake, with impacts on Black and Brown communities. Everyone understands that change is necessary. Some feel that recycling can still be a significant part of the solution for plastic. Our approach is that we need to ensure our solutions are grounded in the best available data. Wasting years of work successfully achieving the wrong solution doesn't really help anybody. Together with a researcher named Jan Dell, we conducted a comprehensive analysis of plastic recycling in the United States and published the results in a report called The Circular Claims Fall Flat. Using the Recycling Partnership's very helpful registry of residential material recovery facilities, known as MRFs, as a guide, we assessed all 367 US MRFs. I think now we're down to 360. We looked at what these facilities accept, which is the first part, but also what they do with the material once they accept it. In many cases, MRFs are required by local laws or contracts to accept material that they cannot actually recycle. So much of the plastic we all put in our blue bins is dumped or burned. Most important finding, only bottles and jugs labeled as 1s or 2s meet Federal Trade Commission standards of recyclability in the United States. 3 through 7 plastics should not be labeled recyclable in the US. Despite FTC guidelines requiring that products claimed to be recyclable must be recyclable in at least 60% of US households, we found dozens of cases where labels were put on plastic packaging destined for incinerators or landfills because the packaging had very little value or market. The closest any of the 3 through 7 plastics come to meeting the minimum standard for recyclability is number 5 polypropylene, which is only recyclable in 30% of US households. Even quite a lot of PET and HDPE, the 1s and 2s, cannot be considered recyclable. Lids, soft plastics, clamshell packaging, for example, are very rarely recycled in the US. Many companies are putting incompatible shrink sleeves on bottles that would otherwise be recyclable, but the sleeves make them unrecyclable waste. Even in the relatively rare cases when plastic is actually recycled, it's important to keep in mind that this is usually just a short pause on the way to being dumped or burned. Unlike materials that can be recycled over and over again, plastic is typically downcycled once before becoming unrecyclable waste. It's also worth questioning whether turning plastic bottles into carpets or textiles is a good idea, given what we know about the enormous quantities of plastic microfibers. The New York Times reported a couple weeks ago, another new study reveals that more than 1,000 tons of tiny fragments rain down each year on national parks and wilderness areas in the American West alone, equivalent to between 123 and 300 million plastic bottles. Researchers found plastic in 98% of their samples, with plastics accounting for 4% of the dust particles. Again, scientists are just beginning to study the human health impacts of microplastics and microfibers, but it's clear that we already have cause for grave concern. Plastic recycling will not solve or even address the health concerns associated with plastic. Only reducing plastic production use can do that, and that will require leadership from industry and policymakers. The best solutions will not involve simply replacing throwaway plastic packaging with another single-use material, but shifting to reuse, refill, and package-free approaches. These solutions already exist and are being piloted now by corporations of all sizes. Incentivizing this shift will be as important as phasing out single-use plastic. And all this is because we can't talk about the problems facing recycling today without talking about plastic. And solutions unless we acknowledge that plastic is part of what is killing recycling. More precisely, we have to stop pretending that most plastics are recyclable or should be recycled. The vast quantities of plastic waste with no value or market to speak of, especially the 3s, the 4s, the 6s, and 7s, are ultimately dumped and burned, or even worse, exported somewhere else to be dumped or burned. But first, they have to be collected and sorted. And this drives down the efficiency of recycling systems and increases the cost. Our insistence on wish cycling plastic trash is driving up the cost of recycling materials that can be used over and over again and that are economically viable. We could spend billions of dollars trying to incrementally increase plastic recycling rates, but the fact is that the economics are terrible and quickly getting worse. There is some demand for recycled PET and HDPE, but virgin polymers are cheaper, and few companies are willing to pay a premium for recycled resin, despite commitments to increase recycled content. And with massive new polyethylene production capacity about to come online, the already low value of recycled resin is likely to get even lower. As for number 5, polypropylene, the one company in the US that is recycling can only handle about 2% of what we're using. It's hard to see how pushing MRFs to accept and sort this plastic garbage is going to lead to anything but more financial challenges for MRFs and more nicely sorted bales of plastic trash going to incinerators and landfills. Finally, the big question for today, for me, is the goal to save recycling or to save all the single-use plastic?
Okay, John, thank you for that. Thank you for your thoughts. Really appreciate it. And I think, one thing that's really interesting with this conversation is, we know what the past is. We know that there's been, recycling has not been what it should be. But I want to turn it over to Keefe now real quickly and position another question. What's the path forward? Given the fact that recycling, the infrastructure really has never met the goals it needs to be. We can either ask it, Keefe, what would it cost to fix recycling, or put a better tag on it, what do we need to do to make recycling authentic and real and usable to make sure that it's providing value the way it was originally set out to do?
Yeah, well, the reason we work in recycling is because this is what we see as our piece of the climate action pie. And I think too often recycling is seen as the catch-all solution for solving what's produced. If you put it out and you can recycle it, then it's net zero. And that's really not true. So John has a marine background, and so do I. I started off as a researcher working with sea turtles in Costa Rica and freshwater turtles in North Carolina, and got hooked by this recycling thing because it's so fascinating. It seems so simple, right? You put your stuff in the bin and it goes away and turns into something else. And really what it is this wild mashup of interests. 20,000 local governments in the US, including Beaufort County and North Carolina, all making their own decisions on what to do with material. If recycling, as I said earlier, is truly a supply chain, that's a crazy way to start a supply chain, right? This really disjointed start. It's also a reactive way of problem solving. And I think that's the big part of what we're trying to get to, is that it's never okay to produce something and hope that it will be recycled. It's not okay to hope that recycling solves the environmental production or offsets the environmental production of something. But we do know that, especially as our world, we do know that people demand goods, and the delivery of goods to them could be done in a way that is better than it is today. And so the work that the partnership does takes a very can-do, action-focused approach to understanding what does the world look like that we live in right now, and what are we going to do about it. And so the question of what would it take to fix recycling takes into understanding that only half of Americans have access to recycling as easily as they can throw something away, and that's a problem. It takes into effect that communities don't have the staff to run what they're doing. It thinks about the fact that many communities are paying double to send something to the front door of a MRF as what it would cost to send it to a landfill. How does that line up with a growing national commitment to circularity? If we're just pricing disposal so low and it really hasn't changed in 30 years, well, that seems like a problem. It also is looking at the fact that MRFs are often looked to be the guiding light of recyclability, but also asked to solve things, when really what does a MRF do? A MRF sorts mixed bales or inbound mixed materials into bales of isolated materials, and they can only do that if there is an effective market for it to turn into something new. That market has to compete with really cheap virgin resin. It's when you look at the entire system, you see how much work is needed in order to make sure that people are able to get the goods that they need or often want, and that recycling needs to mature into something that can help keep the molecules that create all the stuff around us, from my bicycle on, and give it a life for the future. So we think the price tag to level up the US recycling system is about $10 billion if you add in a secondary processing to do the hard work of separating out stuff like lots of plastic film gets stuck in paper bales, and those need to be separated out. You can pretty quickly get to a $12 billion price tag.
Wow, thank you for that. Before transitioning to John and asking another question, I want to stay with something John said. John said that we need to focus on turning off the tap, i.e. plastic is part of the recycling problem. What are your thoughts on that? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you have some alignment? Really curious on what your perspective is on that statement.
Well, I don't, plastics is too many different things, I think, to have one answer. You know,
right.
How polypropylene is a great example. So we just launched the Polypropylene Coalition, and John Hocevar, you and I have talked about this in the past. Like, polypropylene is an example of material where industry has really leaned into trying to build a better recycling system for it, just like the metals guys did for metals industry, and just like PT did for the PT world. And we're really close to a good success. China stopping the acceptance of 337 bales meant that we stopped having a catch-all for non-bottle plastics. And I think that's a good thing, because now we get to really see plastics for what they are and connect them to markets. The thing about US markets for polypropylene is that they are there, and with better value, they will rapidly grow, because it's a network of entrepreneurs that are meant to do that. So I put polypropylene in a category of all the other 337s as far as the opportunity to be constructive in the problem solving. But you asked me, should we turn off the tap? I think, as I said earlier, the partnership works very hard to build a better future, but we also have to deal with what we're all dealing with around us right now. Whether you're in your home or your parents' home, you know, there's still stuff around you. And so while we're working for a stronger future, we're also dealing with the present. And we have hard conversations with companies every day about materials, the reality check of materials that might be nice, really effective packaging tools, but let's not wish cycle them into believing that they might ultimately have some sort of recyclability solution. So I don't know how we turn off the tap, because if we don't package our yogurt in polypropylene, is it glass? The carbon footprint of glass goes up higher. The recycling rate of glass is a challenging thing. So I think before I can jump into should we just turn it off, I ask, if not this, what? And I don't have a good solution for that. What I think we can do is funnel into more likely outcomes of success, and then hold accountable those who are producing to be part of the solution of recovering.
Okay, thank you for that. That's a really, really, really thoughtful. I love the wish cycle piece. I haven't heard of wish cycle before, but I want to continue on though, John Hocevar, back to you on the wish cycle piece. I mean, one thing that was really interesting on your report is really what's been saying is recyclable is not really recyclable, and there's really no oversight of saying what is and what isn't. Seems like there's a lot of not distrust, but ignorance in the consumer space of understanding the recycling landscape. How do we go about then looking at recycling and building like consumer trust in the legitimacy of recycling? What are steps that we can take moving forward to look at recycling, going, okay, I know what this is, I know what's going to happen to it, and maybe there's some traceability of seeing what happens to it. Do you have any insights on that?
There's a lot there. You know, in a lot of cases, what we found was basically just greenwashing, where companies were fully aware that their customers care about plastic pollution and want to at least avoid being part of the problem, and ideally they'd like to be part of the solution. Companies were putting recyclability labels on things that it's probably illegal to even make that claim. So immediately companies can stop doing that, right? Like we informed a whole bunch of these corporations. We haven't seen that many changes yet. It's a difficult time with the administration that we have to get many of these agencies to really hold companies accountable and to file the lawsuits that is part of their job. But we may see more of that. I think ultimately the main difference between the approach that Keefe is taking to some of these issues and that Greenpeace has, even though we have a lot in common, is that Keefe is focused on the world that we have right now, and we're a little bit more focused on the world that we want to build. And so our investment is less in how do we recycle more of the stuff that we make now, and our focus is more on how do we move away from that to a better system.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, I appreciate that. Well, I think
they have to fit together too. I'd love to discuss this a little bit because I think they have to fit together, because I don't think anything, you know, we are pretty vocal on the fact that, you know, greenwashing will never stand for greenwashing. Action helps determine the distinction between greenwashing and doing something. But I also, you know, how do we do something right now without impeding the future that is better, right? Like, none of us want a future that continues the way that we are right now, because we just frankly won't make it, right? Like, but we also don't have any time. We are so out of time to be timid, to be careful. So I see that there's a real marriage of making sure that the work right now to root claims of environmental goals in the reality of how hard that is, to put price tags on things, to write reports like the Bridge to Circularity and our State of Curbside report, to like be super clear about how far away we are from the future, and then to call for policy to help us to do that, to draw the pie of how big is this system change, and then what does everyone's wedge look like, and then try to pull everyone, all the wedges together. I think that's really what we're doing, because, and I think those who are passionate about plastics waste, and I count myself as one of them, need to look at that step change and make sure we're not making incremental steps that prevent us from something big, but that we're also not waiting for the big thing and not putting pressure to make change and for the better in the meantime. So it's a balance.
Yeah, I think it is a balance. It was really interesting. We were having a call today with the European team of a big multinational in food. And it's really interesting when you look at Europe compared to the United States, and the enabling environment that they have on legislation of mandating change, where the U.S. is, John, you mentioned earlier, with the current environment, it's rather challenging because of the lack of legislation. So let's dive into this a little bit. Keefe, Recycling Partnership, Closed Loop Partners, Pyxera Global, we're working on creating a circular city model. And one of the hypotheses of that model is that in the United States, we have to develop legislation first from the city, then to the state, and then to the federal level, right? So my question to you is, when you see in Europe, you see, you know, extended producer responsibility, you see no single-use plastics by 2021, and you look at the state of the United States, what can we do to help move us quicker and further in the legislation context? What are some things that we can do, or what are some examples that you see that we can take ourselves that would be helpful to build an authentically valid system, recycling system in the United States?
Yeah, so, you know, I think with this, I agree with this administration, we're not going to see big change in this space on the federal level right now. But we also know that if we do all the work to try and pass it in one city, and then we replicate it with all the cities, that's 1 times 20,000 or thousands, right? That's too slow. So we have to figure out how to advance it. So when I talk about the policy piece, the US has not had a policy approach that matches Canada or Europe or others. And I think it's pretty easy to ask ourselves, should we just replicate what's there? Even with EPR systems in Europe, Europe was still sending stuff to China that wasn't being managed properly. Even with EPR systems, you see higher prices or higher fees on things like flexibles that don't automatically result in a true end market and thus outcome for them. So I think we have to be really careful of what we're asking policy to solve. We think policy has a role in helping a couple different things. One, cheap disposal. I mentioned earlier that landfills are on average can be half what recycling is. That's a changing ratio all the time, but landfill fees haven't changed in 30 years. We think that's a problem. We think that too, it's a challenge in this country that local governments have to pay for this whole system to work. And as we look in, as we use our crystal ball into what post-COVID looks like, we know that local government budgets are going to be hit hard, and asking them to fund this system alone is not viable. So sustainable financing so that communities can continue to offer programs is essential. 3, we think that you know, we have some leading actors in the corporate space who are leaning in to be productive, but we don't see everyone engaged. So how do we create a common pool for a corporate-based investment to do to really lean into a fourth piece of creating the advanced infrastructure that makes sure that recycling is not that reaction I talked about, but a proactive. So instead of just saying, are you for or against policy, I think you're trying to say, what's the pie? What's the piece of a pie that a policy could address? And those are ones that really interest us right now.
Thank you for that, Keefe. I want to transition to John and also start weaving in some of the audience questions, because we have a really engaged audience, and I want to make sure that, you know, they're getting their questions asked as heard. We had one question, John, related to policy. Has Greenpeace published a similar report about the status of the affairs in the EU for a comparison? We know what you about the US. Are you working on anything in the EU right now that you may be publishing?
We don't have a similar study in the EU. It's a good idea. It's something that we've talked a bit about. We've been really engaged in the EU policy conversations, and we have our offices around the world, including Europe, that are active on the campaign. But no, we haven't been working on that report yet.
Okay. Thank you for that. There's one here. It's kind of a question that's near and dear to my heart, which I think I'll lead with you, but I also want to hand it over to Keefe to answer after you, John. One of the big issues that we see in the United States is it's always on the consumer to stop littering, the consumer to dispose of items properly. It's the consumer's fault. The question is also, what about consumer responsibility disposing of items properly? Why is it always on the consumer? John, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Well, I think it's not an accident that that's where a lot of the focus is. Industry invested pretty heavily in putting forward the idea that this was our fault. You know, it's not that they've packaged everything in materials that, wow, it wouldn't be a webinar right now without a dog or something. But anyway, the fact is that we don't have, as consumers, we don't have great options a lot of times. It's really hard to walk into a restaurant, a supermarket, a bar, really almost anywhere, and buy something without getting some throwaway plastic packaging. And yes, there are things that we can do as individuals to help make a difference, but ultimately our real power comes when we work together to make sure that policymakers and corporate executives know that we want a better world. We want options that are going to work for the future, and not just for, you know, very, very, very short term, like a few seconds worth of convenience.
You know, I get to use my pie analogy again, where I think there was a lot of effort to make sure the consumers had a big piece of the pie. I don't think that the consumer piece is smaller. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't talk about reduction, reuse. We need to talk about green chemistry and buying what you need and needing what you buy. And that is something that we all must do. However, we could do that all day long and not solve for the health of the products that are on the shelf. So the Recycling Partnership was formed 6 years ago to be an action agent in this space because we needed a way to engage the companies in being true problem solvers, not marketing campaigners. We at the partnership do a lot of communications, and we help local recycling program coordinators make better communication campaigns to help their communities get involved. But that is one piece of the pie. We work equally. I just can't emphasize enough that it is not just up to the consumer, and we fight that fight every day. I think you're still on mute, so from the dog, it's been.
You know, and my dog didn't like that question, and so we're going to move to another question that came on, and I'm going to give a little narrative for it, and I think this goes to both of you. Container deposit laws known as bottle bills are proven ways to reduce litter and boost recycling. Beverage containers with deposits have a significantly higher recycling rate than beverage containers without deposits. For instance, glass bottles have a 14% recycling rate if they do not have a refundable deposit, and glass bottles have a 64% recycling rate if they do. Only 8 states have beverage deposit laws, many going back 30 years. Is it time for a national bottle bill or at least adoption in additional states? Keefe, let's start with you, then go to John. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, if all I was concerned about was just PET or just glass, I would be very much for just a deposit legislation. I think when people look to a deposit example, I think it's pretty quick to see the success, and I agree that that is there. What worries me about deposits as a solution is that deposits can also route valuable material away from curbside collection programs that then have to make the economics work. They have to work harder to make the economics work when that valuable material is out. So I think that when I'm talking to companies about could deposits solve this, it's the question of what are you trying to solve? Are you trying to get all the PET bottles back? Well, then it can be a very good tool for that. But it could be, it's not building the system that we've been talking about. It's not advancing for every other material that's out there as well. And I've never seen a deposit scheme that includes pouches and wraps and chip bags. And so are we going to put a deposit on everything that a consumer buys? You know, at point of checkout, your receipt would have a long list of that. So we work with several states and cities, you know, that are part of a deposit program, and they can be very strong. I think deposits could be part of a robust portfolio of policy, but I just would caution people to be careful before we assume that deposits are the only way that we get stuff back. Instead of thinking about getting stuff back, why don't we think about a system that ensures that the end of life is managed at the point of design, and think about them more holistically.
Thank you for that. I have some more questions and I want to continue on that road. John, do you have some brief comments on that one?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Dealing with the enormous variety of waste that we generate is not going to have any one single answer. There's just no way. And I agree with Keefe that a national container deposit law would be a great piece of a more comprehensive approach. For example, there's a national container deposit scheme as part of the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. That has been proposed for Congress. I think that you know, as Keith said, it's a proven tool to increase recovery rates, and that's something I think that we can all get behind. Like any tool, it's possible to do it wrong, but based on the goals that we share and the data that we have from programs so far, it seems to be a no-brainer that we have to make this work.
Thanks for that. Keith, I'm going to transition back to you now with an interesting question, and it's something that's a little bit non-traditional, which is nice. Given the size of the U.S. and the vast fragmentation and regulation, as well as proper recycling infrastructure, what can non-manufacturing corporations that produce large volumes of material do to help improve their end-of-life management?
So are we, what does that mean? Like retailers and brands?
So if you're not producing, let's say you're a large energy company, right? And you're not really, you're getting large volumes of material to make said infrastructure, whether that's solar, whether that's wind turbines. What can you do to help improve the end-of-life management? Is it recycling related? Is there anything else that is non-plastic materials? Is there anything that we can do in the United States to recycle material that is a little bit more nebulous, let's say?
Yeah, so if you're, I think the question is, how do I know if the things I'm doing are right? I want to be an engaged corporate partner on this, and there is no singular clearinghouse for understanding which material is better than another, because it's all about how the material is applied. So PET in a different form is not as recyclable as PET in a bottle form. So I think that you know, this could be an opportunity to call for clearer information, clearer public source information on what it means to produce products, whatever they are, durable goods even, and that could be a policy approach. I think that broader companies who want to be engaged with this can look at how they interact with what comes to mind is the retail sector. You know, if you're doing anything that engages the retail sector, we spend a lot of time talking with retailers of if we could better harmonize some consistency around measuring or material specs or how we approach sustainable design, not just design for recycling, we're talking about sustainable design, you know, and add for some consistency. I think that would be another thing to look at. This group could also take a look at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation goals and see how they align with the interests that they have in mind. And then I think, you know, my contact information is there. I'd be happy to talk about specific to this company. What are you looking for? Who can we connect you with? Because whenever anyone is asking good questions about how can I be an eager problem solver, the Recycling Partnership wants to help them connect with the right people.
Oh, cool. Well, I want to bring out another question out of both of you. And John, we're going to start with you. We talked a lot about trade-offs, right? There's trade-offs. If you move, let's say, from one type of packaging into another, what are the trade-offs that we have environmentally? So what's the greater good? You know, Coca-Cola recently put out a bottle that's plant-based, for example. And so the question that I have here that I want to ask is it feasible to switch from plastic film to paper fiber packaging? Amazon did this in India. Why not do this in the United States? What's your thoughts?
It's a good question. You know, I think in general, we should be trying to minimize the shift from one single-use material to another single-use material. Like there are inevitably going to be environmental trade-offs. I think reuse, refill, package-free, whenever possible, is going to get us a lot farther. Paper definitely has some advantages over plastic. There's no question. You know, you can recycle it more times. You can sustainably manage harvests, but we do have some concerns there too. I mean, there isn't this growing endless supply of sustainable timber or pulp that we can tap into. So we do need to be careful about that. And just to get back to our earlier conversation just a little bit, I think when we're talking about a comprehensive approach, and there's definitely going to be several different pieces to anything that really works, one of those pieces pretty much has to be getting rid of some of the stupid stuff. And that includes a lot of the soft plastics, plastic bags, multi-layer plastic sachets. These are the kinds of things that are really the death of recycling, as well as a lot of other things. But I mean, it's hard to make recycling function while we continue to produce, what is it, 100 billion, several hundred billion plastic bags a year.
Thank you for that. Keefe, your turn. On the question on, you know, the Amazon point, what's your thoughts on that?
I think I agree that shifting to one to the other is not just always a solution. I think that the problem with any LCA that's out there is none of them have a category for whale health, or, you know, there's life cycle analyses tend to stop with energy production, and paper can, you know, certainly break down in water. Molded pulp also takes which means, like, you know, if you buy a paper egg carton that's molded pulp, a lot of times that can take a lot of energy to dry and make. You know, there's trade-offs with every decision, and I don't think that it's fair to say you should just move from one to another. I think we can align around a core set of materials that start with better chemistry, that have opportunities for circular lives multiple times over, and that think about a better health. But frankly, it's not as easy. You know, just because we started producing something doesn't mean that you can just, you know, it has to be that way in whether it's one material or another. I think we have to talk about what problem are we trying to solve when we produce that project, that material to start with, and then really address it from there. And I am heartened by the increased you know, our name is obviously the Recycling Partnership, but we work on a lot more than that. And I am excited and kind of confused at the same time about ideas around refill models and how do we make them work, and how do, you know, how do we advance better, different thinking. I think that it's not, the leading edge of that is not just gonna, we're gonna need to be in a tough spot before I think we can really get everyone to a whole new place, but we will trick ourselves if we only think about material substitution in the meantime.
Okay, great. Well, I want to take us home now. We're almost near our time, and I want to thank both of you for engaging today. And we had an audience with really good questions. And I got a question here, which I think wraps it up nicely. So if you could just take a minute or two to both answer this question, we really appreciate it. Question: it's inspiring to hear talk of approaching recycling from a systems change perspective. As mentioned throughout the call, environmental racism has been linked to evidence of poor health, environmental, and socioeconomic outcomes for poor communities of color. And both grassroots efforts, consumer side, bottom up, and policy, top down, are necessary to create and sustain desperately needed structural change. What are best practices from your research and experience as to how and when to engage partners in the public health and policy making sectors space at all levels? So tell us, I guess what we're saying here is how do you engage as a citizen? How do you really start looking at it from the work that you're doing and what you're seeing to give some guidance to folks who really want to take action here? Because as we're seeing, COVID-19, we're having right now economic issues. Then we have the cultural issues and the racism issues that we have in the space right now. Provide just some tips for everybody to take us home that can make people feel empowered that they have a role to do something. And Keefe, we'll start with you, and then we'll transition to John.
I think the first step is to know that you need to use your voice. So I was looking up for current information. I've read reports about understanding the type of people who live closer to landfills, brownfields, and other poisonous spots, and they are more proportionately brown and black families. Those have not been updated in years. I can't find current ones, and so I was just talking with the team today about maybe we need to lean in and getting some more current information. So I'd say what we're asking everyone in this space to do is to ask questions, to lean in more and think about it from the systemic problem of racism and how that might cloud our thinking on really what we're trying to answer when it comes to environmental racism and social justice. I think the North Star on this is that every citizen needs the chance to live a healthier life, and we can't expect every person to be able to deliver that for themselves. We have to have a better culture that delivers that for all.
Thank you, Keefe. Really appreciate that. John? Your thoughts?
You know, it might be possible to have plastic not be racist. Bear with me here, but you know, as it is now, the system that we live in, the places where plastic is being refined and are almost always in communities of color, and the impacts that those communities face are pretty severe. So we can have, you know, throwaway plastic packaging. And then at the other end, where we see landfills, where there's going to be toxics leaching into the water and soil, those are almost always going to be in poor communities, often communities of color. Where there are incinerators, those are even more likely to be in communities of color. And so, you know, it's easy for us to lose sight of the fact that the plastic that we use every day is really harming people, especially people of color, in the system that we have now. So for companies to be able to continue to produce plastic without disproportionately harming communities of color, they're going to have to work really hard in the system that we have today.
Thank you, John. I want to thank all the audience. So first of all, thank you, John and Keefe, for our speakers, first and foremost, for taking the time out of your day and having such a great discussion. It was everything we asked and more. So thank you for that, and look forward to having you on future shows. And the audience, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Moving forward, you can go to pyxeraglobal.com/org, and you can check out our paradigm shift publication as well as our zero plastic waste approach. to ridding the world of waste. So thank you again, everyone. Have a wonderful week ahead. Have a great weekend, and thank you, everyone, for your time. We'll be in touch.
All right.
Thanks,
Goodbye to
John.
your
Thanks,
dog.
Keith.
Thank
Bye,
you.
all.
Thank you.